Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Oklahoma Live. My name is Jason Ray. I'll be your host, kind of taking you through the next hour and 20 minutes leading up to the first game of the season. We've made it, guys. We've made it. It is officially game week. Not necessarily for Oklahoma yet. Oklahoma's got 1 week left, but game week for college football. They'll be back on the national stage. So very, very exciting just to be back. It's the longest off season of any sport in college football. Being college football has the biggest break. So we've got wall-to-wall action starting this week, and then certainly next week with week one with everybody again starting. So we've got a lot to cover today to go through. So we'll talk a lot about the week 0 games starting today. There's a few that are of interest, certainly to me, but I think as Oklahoma fans just watching overall, so we'll get into. I've put down my latest and greatest depth chart predictions for Oklahoma, kind of looking at the offense and defense based on where we're at now, understanding that Oklahoma's certainly out of fall camp and they're going. They're still practicing, obviously, but they're in game week prep now, so they're out of fall camp and really kind of into in-season stuff as well. We can talk about that. Any of your questions, your comments, talk a little bit about Tulane game preview. Is it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? Is it something to keep an eye on? Obviously, this weekend is the Hurricane Ida as it hits landfall. I think it's supposed to hit landfall Saturday sometime this evening, more probably Sunday morning through Sunday evening, more likely. So we'll get into that, what the contingency looks like. Joe Castiglione put something out there yesterday just in terms of what the contingency looks like for Oklahoma playing in this game. I do think it will get played one way or the other. It looks like Oklahoma has a contingency there, to possibly be able to host that game. So we'll talk about that. Any questions, anything that you have, we'll talk a little bit about. I had my top 25 preview yesterday with Mark, and we'll talk about that as well. So other than that, Come join us. Last Word on Sports / college football. So we cover certainly Oklahoma there, but we cover the national scene. If it's Oklahoma, if it's Big 12, we've got West Virginia, we've got Texas Tech coverage, we've got some Texas coverage. So all across the country, if you're getting your fill, needing to get your fill of college football just in general. Come join us there. And then here's my official Twitter handle @JasonRay1. Come follow me. We'll retweet a lot of Oklahoma stuff, obviously, through the year. We retweeted all of our articles that we had this week, leading up to this week, this weekend's games for week 0. And from a segue perspective, we'll look at some of those games before we kind of get into the meat, to allow some of you guys to kind of get in here and take a look and see what we're doing. So, the first game of the weekend, Nebraska at Illinois, starting at 12 on Fox. Really interested in that. I think Nebraska is I think the lines went down a little bit. I saw it as high as 8.5, maybe even 9. I've seen 6.5 this morning. So should be a really good game. Brett Bielema, making his debut at Illinois, certainly was previously at Wisconsin, so no stranger to the Big Ten. Nebraska's got they've got a lot of pressure this year. Coming from a team with Scott Frost really kind of joining in a few years ago, as a guy that thought that they would take them back to at least somewhat where they were before. They haven't been there. In his first 3 years, they've yet to make a bowl game. So I think it's certainly a big year. He's got that pressure on him in terms. I think he's got to make a bowl game this year in order for him to keep his job. But then I think certainly you've got a little bit of a cloud of controversy surrounding the team, specifically based on the NCAA investigation with them practicing during some of the COVID time last year when they weren't supposed to. So really, really interesting game to start the season off there in Champaign for Nebraska and Illinois. And then at 1 p.m., Connecticut at Fresno State, under the radar game certainly. Connecticut's an interesting story. There's a team, one of the few FBS teams that did not play a game at all last year. So they're and they've moved away. They're kind of in the independent category right now. So I think it's interesting as we look at some of these teams that are playing early on and look and see, what do they look like if there's a couple of the FCS teams that have that have did not play at all in 2020. So looking to see what kind of rust that they have. So very interesting to see what's that game. I think Fresno State is a prohibitive favorite in that game as well. So then when you moved a little bit later in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, Hawaii and UCLA, good matchup here. Hawaii under Todd Graham, I think most people around here know who he is. Coached at Tulsa, Arizona State, and now second year there. Really good offensive team. Not sure how much they have on the defensive side of the ball, but UCLA is an interesting team as well. UCLA, obviously Oklahoma had a home and home with them recently, so I think there's some interest in that program. Chip Kelly, it's a really big year for him. He hasn't had the kind of career that a lot of people thought that he might have coming into certainly with the success that he had in Oregon. Not necessarily he had a lot of success in the NFL, but coming back to UCLA on the West Coast, I think a lot of people had a lot of positive thoughts about him. And I think they were close last year. I believe they lost 4 games by a total of 15 points. So I think I think they are ready to be much, much better, much improved in that 4th year under Chip Kelly. So that will be a very interesting game to watch, as well as those are Nebraska and Illinois, and Hawaii and UCLA are the 2 big Power 5 teams that are playing. If you're just like me, you're just starved for football at this time of the year, you'll really take anything that you can get. If you guys have ESPN Plus, Eastern Illinois plays Indiana State at 5 p.m. Don't have much in terms of just kind of, breaking down that game, but certainly if you're looking for something to watch, it's college football. I think it's early on. I think we'll all, certainly take that. And then the ESPN Game Day was there live in Atlanta, talking about the HBCU game, Alcorn State versus NC Central. Again, very interesting. Both of these teams did not play at all last year, so I would expect to see a lot of rust. Alcorn State's probably the favorite. They were a SWAC winner, a couple of years ago, 2019. So I think they come in a little bit more talented. So, but really interesting. I think it's a really good showcase for the FCS, early on in the season there in Atlanta. UTEP and New Mexico State, honestly, 2 of the worst teams in the FBS game. So it may not necessarily be a good game, but I think it could be a competitive game. So, like I said, 2 of the worst teams in the FBS, probably in the country, battling it out. But this is on Valley Sports if you guys have that or are able to watch that. So I think that will be, like I said, not a great game in terms of how well it'll be played, but I think a close game there at New Mexico State. And then finally, the last game of the season, the last game of the day, Southern Utah, San Jose State. San Jose State was one of the most improved teams last year, winners of the Mountain West Conference, beat Boise State in that conference championship game. Nick Starkel, who is a transfer from Texas A&M, is there in his 2nd year in San Jose. So another interesting game, FBS versus FCS, to end the day. So if you're not a great lineup, just totality, but looking at Nebraska and Illinois, Hawaii and UCLA are the certainly the 2 best games of the day, that we'll get it, that we'll be watching, and we'll get into. If you're interested right now on ESPN, there is a high school game. There's a lot of high school showcase games across the country that are being played either on, I think there's one at ESPN, and then there's 2 or 3 on ESPN2 today. A couple of St. Thomas Aquinas is a big high school program that they're playing right now. So if you're interested in that, that's on there as well. So we'll get into some of the more Oklahoma stuff specifically here. So if those of you that watched ESPN College Game Day this morning, I think one of the things that was that was interesting to me is looking at the respect that Oklahoma has nationally this year. I know that we've seen that. I've seen that through a lot of the preview, some of the preview shows, preview magazines, and things like that. However, I think we've got to a point where Oklahoma's defense is something that people know about and something that people respect and think that's going to be a big difference for Oklahoma this year. So the panel had provided their national championship picks or playoff picks, and all five of the panel picked Oklahoma certainly to win the Big 12 and to make the playoffs, and three of those picked. So I believe it was Desmond Howard, Kirk Herbstreit, and Reese Davis. All three picked Oklahoma to win the national championship this year. So I think there's a lot of, obviously nationally, I think there's a lot of respect on this Oklahoma program, and I think overall there's a lot of thoughts and there's a lot of pressure for Oklahoma, being this is the year for them to, at the very least win a playoff game, if not win a national championship. So I've seen a lot of the comments. I know a lot of you guys, gave me a little bit of a hard time in terms of my me having Oklahoma number 5. So here's the way I look at it right now, just kind of, breaking down Oklahoma and breaking down, what they look like from a talent perspective. I think the talent is much better on both sides of the ball. I think offensive line, there's 3 areas that I thought that was a little bit of a, maybe not necessarily a concern, but things that I was looking for out of Oklahoma to start the year. So the running back room, the depth there, the offensive line, and the secondary depth as well. So I think 2 of those 3 things have been answered with a resounding exclamation point. I think the offensive line has performed very well in camp, and I think Riley and Bedenbaugh for just being quoted, at that level, feels like the talent is a lot better. They feel like that they're a little bit better, more kind of ready to go than they were last year at this time. And I think one of the things that we heard is they came in a little bit out of shape and not really ready to go, given the fact that they had that fall practice this year. I think that helps everything a lot. So I think they've come in a little bit more ready to go, and I think there's been a lot of good competition between the offensive line and the defensive line. When you look at the defensive secondary, I think there's a lot of talent there. The infusion of talent. There's a lot of kids that didn't play a lot last year that will play. DJ Graham, Justin Harrington. DJ Graham didn't play a lot, played a little bit more towards the end of the year. Justin Harrington was out, all last year. Certainly Woody Washington played a lot. Jaden Davis played a lot, but you got guys like Latrell McCutcheon, who will probably come in and play some. So I think they've got a lot of depth there that it was, maybe a little bit of a concern early on. And then you look at the safeties. You got a guy like Key Lawrence, and then you got like Billy Bowman and Jeremiah Cradell at the nickel spot that has an opportunity to play well. So I think going into it, so the running back room is still the biggest concern. Obviously it's the biggest concern on this team. I think right now at this point, really at the depth. So one thing that I illustrated yesterday if you guys were on, is Oklahoma hasn't had their top 2 running backs play every game since 2015. So 6 years. If Oklahoma has Eric Gray and Kennedy Brooks, they're healthy, relatively healthy, I think Oklahoma is a prime candidate to make it to the national championship game. Now, having said that, if they happen to have some injuries, or they have a couple of kids out, or at least one kid out for a game or 2, it could be of some concern. So I think that's really what led me to the number 5 ranking. But I certainly believe if they're healthy and they're playing well, I think Oklahoma has every chance, and I do feel like they are a solid pick to go to that national championship game. And I would actually echo that as well. Just the likelihood of them going through an entire year without having any major injuries or concerns really at that position is it'll be tough to navigate. Hopefully they can. Absolutely rooting for them to do that. If nothing else, certainly for their health. You don't want anyone injured, anyone going through anything like that. So that's where I'm at. We'll go through the depth chart on both sides of the ball. We'll take your questions and comments and and kind of things like that to go through. So bring whatever questions you have. If it's about Tulane, bring those. Just OU in general, any specific positions you want me to talk a little bit more about, I'm happy to do that. If we want to look through the schedule a little bit, if you got any questions about any of the games today, kicking off, whatever you have, we'll go through some of the comments here first, and then we'll start going into, as we get a little bit more people in here, let some people filter in. Right now we have 15 on the line, so share, like, subscribe, get this out there. Let's talk some Oklahoma football before we get started with week 0 today, and then certainly next week it's a little bit of it's a little influx just in terms of, so I'm actually planning on attending the game, going to the game in New Orleans. However, with Hurricane Ida, not sure what that looks like. So just keep an eye on the kind of the notifications for the channel. We'll let you know exactly when we're going to go live. I think with if I'm here in my home, we'll probably go live, a couple of hours before the game starts, game kicks off. So 9 a.m. is probably what we'll be thinking. And then almost immediately afterwards, after the game's over, we'll be, we'll get cranking up with a post-game show and talk a little bit about the game. So keep an eye on that. So we'll look and see how that goes with with everything going on this week from a weather perspective. All right, so let me look at some of we'll go through some of the comments and questions here first before we kind of get started with the depth chart. Let's see. I feel all conference except Big Ten. Ohio State is the leader, but the rest, who knows? Last year had no COVID. Real thoughts. So good question, Sooner Thron. So I think the Big Ten was certainly down last year. I think Penn State was down. Michigan State obviously was down. Michigan was down. Wisconsin wasn't quite as good. So certainly Indiana was probably the second best team in that conference. I know certainly they played Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game, but I think Big Ten will be a lot better. I think you've got Indiana should be just as good as they were last year, maybe even better. The record may not necessarily show it because they have a much tougher schedule than they did last year. I like Wisconsin with Graham Mertz. I think one of the things to watch is going to be interesting. Is Graham Mertz the kid that we saw before COVID or after COVID? Where he really wasn't the same quarterback. So Wisconsin's really a trendy pick to meet Ohio State in that conference championship game. Iowa's another team that played really well down the stretch. Started off 0-2, but won their last 5 or 6 games, I believe. So I think they're solid. So and I think Penn State's going to be a lot better. Really, really high on Penn State. I've got them, I think, number 16 overall in the country. So I think they'll be much improved coming into the season. So yeah. Michigan is one of those interesting teams. I think their quarterback play is what they've struggled with. They haven't had excellent quarterback play, so I think that was that's one of those things that should be very interesting to watch, to see how good of quarterback play they start with Western Michigan next week, and then they have a premier non-conference game as they host Washington in week 3. So I think we'll get a good idea of what they look like there as well. So good question, Sooner Thron. So another one here. Phil DeMarco gets a little bit of blame for not closing on Wheaton. So Kamar Wheaton last year and Jace McClellan the year before. So I think where Oklahoma is at the running back room. Number one, some of us bad luck, certainly, and I think when you look at it overall, I think you would be hard pressed to find any team in the country at the FBS level that only has 2 scholarship running backs available to them. I don't know that I've ever even heard or seen a situation, especially a team as good and as powerful and recruits as well as Oklahoma. So I think. So when you look at this, I think this goes back, even further, just in terms of this is kind of a ticking time bomb that just seemed to have blown up a little bit on Oklahoma. You start with a Trey Sermon with him leaving the program, going to Ohio State. I think he was a little bit upset with the playing time that he got at that point. So you can really play. place the blame a number of ways. I don't know that you place the blame on Riley as much there. Maybe more so um, y- y- the running backs coach at that point that had moved on to Texas. So, and then you got some recruiting things with Jace McClellan and Kamar Wheaton that they missed out on. And then you've got, certainly we got Seth McGowan that was dismissed, and then you have Mikey Henderson that was dismissed, and then the snowball effect, it just went further from there, further from there. So I give DeMarco a little bit of blame. However, he's killing it in 2022, 23 recruiting cycle. Ray Leak had a great game in his first game this year. Matter die. You got him. You got Kevin Salchuk. So I think you've got some. So you've got some talent there that they're going to certainly need this year. But I think the Marcus Major stuff was some things that they thought was happening, but and then the Trey Bradford on top of that was really, I think, really disheartening. So make no mistake, the top two running backs are extremely strong. I think you would put Kennedy Brooks and Eric Gray as a 1-2 punch from a running back perspective up against anybody else in the country. But I think beyond that, I think it gets a little bit concerning and seeing exactly what that depth looks like as well. But the one good thing about that is there's a couple of good things. If you're maybe you're a little bit green at the running back position. If your offensive line is strong, you can rely on that offensive line, and then also you have a really good wide receiver core, a really good quarterback to rely on if you need to throw the ball a little bit more. But I think, and then also you got some games early on in the non-conference here that you can toy with some things a little bit. Does Oklahoma go a little bit less two back? Set. I think a lot of times Riley likes to have that two back set with, with having a Kennedy Brooks and Eric Gray in the lineup at the same time. Do you do that? Do you stay away from that a little bit? I think that's one thing that will be interesting. And when you practice, when you play call, how does Riley, how does he go about this? Is it one of those things where, in the back of his mind, he doesn't practice Kennedy Brooks and Eric Gray as much, through live tackling, just to save on some possible injury situations there, or what is that in the back of his mind? So I think that's really, to me, the most intriguing storyline to watch in week one, especially as Oklahoma goes through this, to see exactly where the Sooners are in terms of what that play call looks like. So good thoughts, good question, good comments there, Sooner Thrawn. Jimmy Satterfield, one day more is going to play right tackle or left tackle. So I think Jimmy, he's a kid that can play both. He's one of the only kids that Oklahoma has on that side that's going to play both, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I think he's battling with Anton Harrison on the left side. Certainly, he can play on the right side. So I think he's a guy. If he doesn't get that starting spot, who could probably come in and play either side from a depth perspective, as well. So I think I would say off the cuff, he'll probably start. His strongest position will be the left tackle, but I think he certainly can move to both the left and the right side. So thanks for that question, Biggie. Yeah, I was interesting. I actually attended a local high school game here at so I'm in Bixby, so went and watched Bixby play Mansfield Timberview. By the way, if you're local here and you're around, Bixby's one of the best. I know in this side of the state around the Tulsa area that Tulsa Union, Broken Arrow, Jinx, Owasso gets a lot of pub, but I believe Bixby's won 37 straight now. So they go to Jinx next Friday. So that should be a really good game. But yeah, Jinx. So I went to that game and recorded the high school game. LT Overton was still hurt. He's dropped his first 12 in terms of exactly where he's going to school. So one of the best, maybe the number one player in the 2023 class overall. He's pretty high on Oklahoma's list, and then vice versa. So really was hoping to see him, but yeah, he was out nursing an ankle injury. I think he said he had mentioned he would be back next week, but yeah, I think that was one thing that I was looking for, but a little bit disappointing to see as well. Yeah, no, I think on the recruiting trail, you got to kind of see it to believe it, right? Specifically, I know there's a little bit of PTSD, from Oklahoma fans alike, just on how they've struck out on some of those running backs over the last couple of years. So I think being able to keep those kids throughout the cycle and see them sign is a really kind of a see it to believe it type of thing. Sooner Hurricane, thanks for the comments again, man. I appreciate you jumping in and giving us. I know you're certainly a big Miami supporter, but also support us. So yeah, definitely hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Let's get this channel growing. I'm really excited to say that this channel within the overall Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football overall, is one of the biggest growing and highest growing channels that we've had. So keep joining, keep telling your friends. Like I said, I'm excited to do these pre-game and post-game stuff on Fridays. I'm sorry, on Saturdays, and then me and Mark will do live show. Remember, we've done it Friday for the off season, but now that we're in season, we're going to move that to Wednesday at 11:30. I know it's a little bit tough, but you guys can still see. If you're not able to interact live, you can interact. You can watch the videos as they post. So keep an eye on that as well. So yeah, come join us in the conversations. Come chat, interact with us here as we talk through some of that stuff. And one more comment here, Sermon till the big. Yeah, no, he had a monster game in that Big Ten title game last year. So yeah, he was still good. I think he's a guy that that felt like he needed to see the field a little bit more and probably should have a little bit at Oklahoma. Specifically there was a couple of games where he didn't even get the ball, but a couple of times. So yeah, no, I think that's a fair point here. So no other comments and questions as of right now. So let's kind of dive into the let's dive into my depth chart projections as of right now, and we'll walk through the offense first, and then pause for any questions or comments that you guys have, and then go on to the defensive side of the ball. So first, obviously, we all know who QB1 is. I think the one thing that's very interesting looking at this quarterback room is, from everything that I've heard, Caleb Williams each and every day is approaching this and attacking this as if this is an open competition, and has performed extremely well. So I think while Rattler's the number one guy, I don't think anyone would be extremely. This is really kind of coming from inside the program. I don't think anybody would just be extremely concerned on the trajectory of the season if they had to go with Caleb Williams. So he, obviously, those of us that watched him in the spring games saw the talent. He's got a lot of arm talent. He's, his legs he's a little bit better in terms of running the football than Spencer Rattler. So I think Oklahoma would be in a good spot if Rattler happened to go down for a game or two, or in a situation where he was, Caleb Williams was called upon. And certainly there could be some packages for him. I definitely believe Caleb is going to get his 4 games in, and then certainly as the season goes on, Oklahoma will evaluate that. But honestly, the biggest surprise out of the quarterback room was the announcement from Lincoln Riley that Ralph Rucker had really secured that number 3 spot, over Micah Bowens. I think the thought was coming into the season that Bowens would be, clearly the number 3, quarterback on this team, the Penn State transfer. But it looks like Ralph Rucker, as a true freshman coming in as a preferred walk-on out of Texas, so it has secured that number 3 job. So good for him. Just in terms of, I think that there's a couple of games that he'll probably get some action in. I would think Western Carolina, certainly, I would expect him to get a little bit of action there, certainly, as well as Caleb Williams. So quarterback room, I think, is in a solid position. I think that Caleb Williams is the best backup that Oklahoma has had in a long time, and certainly if things go to plan, you would probably see this being his team next year. So moving to the running back spot, so I have Eric Gray and Kennedy Brooks really as a 1A, 1B. I think they're both get almost equal playing time, especially with where they are at from a depth perspective. I think you look at a guy. Both of those guys bring something different to the table. I think Eric Gray has a little bit more wiggle to him, maybe a little bit better out of the backfield in terms of catching the ball. And I think Kennedy Brooks, he doesn't wow you with anything. He doesn't wow you with his speed, and he just kind of looks like an average guy out there just coming off the bus. But I think, his vision is incredible. I think he has the best vision of any of the running backs that Oklahoma has, and I think his ability to kind of know and hit the hole is strong. And not that he's not terrible out of the backfield, but I think Eric Gray brings a little bit more. So I think Eric Gray is probably your starter, with Kennedy Brooks certainly playing, equal snaps, but maybe a little bit behind in terms of that starter. But I think, like I said, I don't think it really matters necessarily who starts and who comes off the bench, because both of those kids are going to play a ton. And then for third string, Oklahoma can go a whole lot of different ways here, but I've got Jaden Knowles here as a guy that really played well in the spring game. You can insert a Todd Hudson here as well as another guy that'll get a look, and I think it'll be kind of like a hot hand situation. Whoever Riley feels like he can trust a little bit more between those two. If it really gets into a dire situation, you could see a Jeremiah Hall coming over, maybe playing a little bit from time to time, maybe getting some carries and spot situations. But I think Riley might be a little bit innovative in terms of what that third guy looks like this year. I think they'll start with Jaden Knowles and see what that looks like on the field, and then kind of go from there for that running back spot. So I just kind of put all of this together from an H-back and a tight end perspective. I think certainly your number one H-back is Jeremiah Hall, a guy that we've heard that has had incredible spring and summer, and really is one of the leaders on the offensive team, just from a leadership perspective, from a vocal perspective. And then obviously you got Austin Stogner as your tight end. So I think Oklahoma will move some of those kids around a little bit. So you could see, you might even see Jeremiah Hall line up in a prototypical tight end spot. You may see Austin Stogner line up in an H-back spot. And then, I think Braden Willis is a guy that's going to play a ton this year. Maybe one of the most impressive kids that I've heard about, in terms on the offensive side of the ball, just in terms of exactly what he's brought to the team, how much he's improved his body, his catch radius, just everything that he's brought to the team. So I think you're going to see a lot out of him this year. Jackson Sumlin had a really good spring game. I think he'll be there to provide some depth to that room. They're still a little bit small, I think, in terms of what that depth looks like, not where they would love to be. So I think Jackson Sumlin will bring that added depth to that room as well. So now, kind of looking at the offensive line, and the offensive line, before I kind of go through, it's so hard to look at the depth chart for this offensive line, because Bedenbaugh, more than any other position, he mixes and matches guys to really get the right combination that he's looking for. And even sometimes, he goes the first couple of games just looking to see what that looks like, and then, towards the end of the end of the non-conference season, he'll kind of set on a 5 that he likes the most. But I think this is from everything I'm hearing, this is where it looks like it'll land early on. I've got Anton Harrison starting at the left tackle, with Wanye Morris being the primary backup. Wanye will play a lot. Certainly it may end up being more of kind of 50-50 thing, and it may be more of a who plays better in the games. As Jimmy asked about that earlier on in the podcast here, I think Wanye could play on the right side should they need him to play over there. I think Anton Harrison has taken that extra step, that they would like him to. They had liked him to take over the summer. So I think he's probably there right now with Wanye Moore really on his heels. Wanye's been banged up a little bit in the camp, so that may have helped Anton a little bit. But I think Anton's pretty solid there at left tackle. But I don't think it's anything to worry about on either side. On either of these kids, I think they're both more than capable of playing. Left guard, I got Marquise Hayes, the starter. No debate here. I think this is solid. I think as we go through, our left guard, center, and right guard are pretty static in terms of There's not a whole lot of movement there. I think Robert Conjol will be your primary backup there, and as you see as we going forward, he'll be a backup at a couple other positions as well that we'll see. But Marquise Hayes is really the guy here, and one of the best offensive linemen that Oklahoma had last year, and I think he's one of the guys that Oklahoma brought to the table, this year in terms of a guy that's been incredibly impressive through the spring and summer, and has lost some weight, gained some strength, and really a position of need for the Sooners. At center, Andrew Rame, and then Robert Conjol here. I think Conjol will be a little bit of a swing guy at guard and center, being that backup. Ian McIver will kind of factor into that as well at the center position. Maybe, if there's a situation where you have to have Marquise or you have to Conjol somewhere else, I think McIver can actually flow in here where he's backed up Creed over the last few years. So, I think this is a position of a little bit of uncertainty. I wouldn't necessarily say concern. I think this was the biggest hole, that Oklahoma had with Creed Humphrey, leaving the program, going to the NFL, which looks like he could be a day one starter for Kansas City, by the way. But I think, Andrew is a guy that kind of started taking a little bit of hold of this job in the spring. We saw him, start in the spring game a little bit light. I think he's had a really good summer, getting stronger. I think he kind of took that job really early on in camp, which is absolutely what the coaches would have liked to see, him to kind of solidify himself in that position as well. So I think he's strong there. Remains to be seen. Beanbo was extremely complimentary of him, throughout the fall camp, really asking, what he likes about him, and he said everything. I think the one thing, and I think that'll come. He said maybe not quite as strong as what Creed was at this point in his career, but I think that'll come, certainly. Yeah. So I think he's a very intelligent kid. I think he has the ability to, in everything that Beanbo asks his team to do. I think it's something that it's a big strength, I think, for Oklahoma to have a cerebral kid like Andrew Rame there as well. So if we move over to the right guard, again, everything I've heard, Chris Murray was certainly he was battling for it with Andrew Rame in the spring, and maybe they looked at him a little bit early on in fall camp, but really after Andrew Rame solidified that, I think they felt like Chris Murray's home was that right guard, and everything that I've heard, he's just been mauling people at that guard position. So I think it's extremely strong to have Chris Murray right there at that right guard spot. Savion Byrd, who is a guy that was Beanbo talked a lot about, wasn't necessarily sure how much he'll play, and still I'm not necessarily sure how much he'll play. You could put a couple of other guys here that might play. I mean, but I think Savion Byrd over the last week is a guy that has really come on and really. He's a top 100 freshman All-American by 247. So I think, they know something, and I think he's a guy that could play some should Chris Murray kind of run into trouble or they need to shift the line a little bit. And then when you look at right tackle, I think this is the area where you could possibly see some shuffling. I think Tyrese Robinson moved over and played a little bit right tackle, and I don't think it's anything related to his ability to play guard. I think Chris Murray has just been so strong at that right guard position. It has been really a kind of a natural movement with Tyrese Robinson moving over there. And I think Eric Swinson will be his primary backup as well. You could see, like we talked earlier, certainly could see Wanye Morris moving over here as well. So, I could be totally wrong on this, but this is the way from everything that I've been, kind of seeing and hearing and, reading kind of between the lines. This is where I think Oklahoma will line up, in a week from now against Tulane. So let's move on to the wide receiver spot. Starting at the X, I've got Mike Woods with Theo Weiss backing up. Again, I think this is very similar to what you see out of the running back room. This is kind of a 1A and 1B. I think Mike Woods gives you a little bit more. I think from that wide receiver position, he's a guy that can go He's a guy that can go across the middle. He can make the tough catches. He's got a big body. I think he can move. He can certainly be a kid that that can stretch the field as well. So I think everything that he brings to the table, it will be such a big value add for this team. And then Theo Weeks, we know what we have in here, coming off on coming off of that ankle injury or lower body injury that he had in spring camp. I think he's worked on his upper body. He's very, very strong. You can tell. So obviously he's going to play a ton. But I think this, from a pecking order perspective, this is what I'll say. Wouldn't at all be surprised to see those flipped in any stretch of the imagination. But I think just me looking at what Mike Woods brings a little bit more than what you got from Theo right now. At Y, this one's pretty simple. You got Marvin Mims is moving inside. Certainly could see him interchanging, going outside a little bit as well, but they've moved him inside primarily this year. One of the best freshmen in the country overall, leading receiver for Oklahoma last year in terms of touchdowns. Tied with receptions with Theo Weiss from a year ago. But I think he's a guy that's primed for a spectacular year, and I think he was the main guy really last year for a lot of the season. So I think he'll get a little bit more attention, which may free up some other guys. And Drake Stoops, he's a guy that just keeps making plays, and he's a guy that's impossible to keep off the field. Your personified possession receiver for the Sooners. So he'll be there just like he's been the last few years. Guy that's probably going to catch 25, 30 balls for the Sooners, and all of them are going to be key, and all of them will be big. I think he's a guy just very sure-handed, great route runner. He's not going to wow anybody with his speed, but he's very sure-handed there. Then at the Z, Jaden Hazelwood, looked a little bit stiff early on in the spring. Everything from what I've seen and what I've been told, he's had an excellent camp, fully healthy. They've looked at him. They look at him as having a big year. I think he's the guy of all of them that could make it just a huge step. He's got that NFL body. He's tall. He's muscular. He's strong. The speed's he's probably lost a little bit of a step from where he was initially when he came out of high school, but certainly I think he's there. And I think then when you look at Mario Williams, a guy that's going to play a lot as well. I think one of the best, when we look at the end of the season, going to be one of the best freshman wide receivers in the country, not only the Big 12 or not only on this team, but just overall with this brings a Hollywood factor to this team that they've been missing, in terms of being able to stretch the field and does a lot of things good. Was a little bit banged up early in fall camp, but I think he's back healthy, and he's just been phenomenal. One of those guys that kind of shows out and plays well every single game. Or, I'm sorry, not every single practice and scrimmages and things like that. So. So let's go through some of the questions and comments here, and then we'll go to the defense. So Brian Darby is a guy that I talked about for Jimmy is a guy that could be there in a contingency situation. I think there's a few guys that you might look at, that Oklahoma could move there. From a deep contingency perspective. Brian Darby's a guy, there's some thoughts about Billy Bowman. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that is an absolute worst case scenario for Oklahoma in terms of what the running back room looks like. So I think they'll initially go with Jade Knowles at that third spot. Todd Hudson could be there as well. Not sure between the two of those. I think that's 3 and 4 right now. Like I said, if it gets into a bad situation for Oklahoma in terms of what they might look like at depth, they could pull Jeremiah Hall over there. Then when some of your deep contingencies, you could see Brian Darby. You could even see a Micah Bowens. You could even see Caleb Williams, not necessarily lining up in the prototypical running back spot, but maybe see him flashed out wide, and Oklahoma gets him involved in maybe a screen game or a reverse game or something like that, or maybe even just kind of a decoy. So I think they've got options that they can use. So it's not a dire situation, but Brian Darby is a guy that I had mentioned yesterday, Jimmy, and a guy that I think that could have an opportunity to move to running back if Oklahoma feels like they're in need at that point. So Daryl, thanks for the question. I've got Eric Gray and Kennedy Brooks. I've got Eric Gray 1, Kennedy Brooks 2. I think both of them will play a ton. I think Eric Gray brings a little bit of a more upside in the passing game for Oklahoma as well. Yeah, Rod Farva, thanks for coming. We've got the season is here. It's 11:45, so we're about 15-20 minutes away from Nebraska and Illinois kicking off. So the season is here. We've made it. Yeah, I think that's interesting. The Penn State quarterback. I think originally the idea was for him to really kind of learn under Riley and learned under just under some of these guys like a Spencer Rattler, like a Caleb Williams, and learn and maybe eventually transfer over to a non-Power 5 team to be able to play. So I think him was just kind of being able to mature a little bit as a quarterback. Wouldn't be surprised at all to see him maybe not even here next year, but I think he's a guy that just kind of came in and learned it, and certainly could be of some value if Oklahoma decides that they need some additional depth there at the running back position. Absolutely. I think you'll see Noel. Quick correction: Western Carolina, I think, is who you mentioned. Who you meant, Student Throne. So yeah, I think he'll play a lot there. Certainly, I think he'll get some playing time against Tulane as well. But I think he is a guy that certainly knows the offense and certainly played really, really well in the spring game. Can catch the ball really well out of the backfield. Is elusive. And the reason why I like him a little bit more, I think he's a little bit more put together than Todd Hudson. They're both about 5'7". Todd Hudson's about 180, whereas Knowles is like 197, I think. So I think he's a little bit more put together, can take the pounding maybe a little bit more than a Todd Hudson could. So that's why I've got him 3 and probably Hudson 4. But certainly he'll play a lot there in that game as well. Yeah. Excellent. The best thing about Brooks is his vision, without a doubt. And then Caravan Jackson, good question here. I think everybody has coming out of high school, looked for him to be a kid that really played a lot for Oklahoma. Looked for him to be a kid that really played a lot. Coming out of Oklahoma, I think he was a guy that he was a 5-star guy. Everything that I've heard is he's still a little stiff. I think he's a little slow, and I think he's also a guy that Oklahoma he's having trouble really kind of understanding the playbook, and I think that's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see at this point in his career. But I think that's the things that I've still began to see. Continue to see. That's what has kept him out of the lineup, and I think he might provide some deep backup, but there's nothing that I've really heard or seen in some of the intel that I've got that really expects me to see him have any kind of a major factor on this team this year. So great questions, great comments. Let's move over to the defense here and talk through that. Really, I think it's kind of a show me season for the defense, really just in terms of some of the preseason accolades and the preseason expectations. I think they've got a lot of depth. I think you'll see probably upward to 23, 25 kids playing across all 3 levels of that defense. So I think the depth is there. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how well they play. I think coming in one of the best defensive lines in the country, certainly top five. Wouldn't go so far as to say Oklahoma's got the best defensive line in the country, but I think you can solidly say they would be a top five defensive line right now. Kind of looking at it, and it could get better throughout the season for sure. So kind of looking at the defensive end, you got Isaiah Thomas sliding outside. He played a little bit more inside last year, moved back out when Perkins came back, but I think he'll be more solidified on the outside. Reggie Grimes is a guy that that one person inside the program I had heard is like the way that we talked about Nick Benito after the season and during the season is the way that we're going to talk about Reggie Grimes this year. So high accolades for a kid that Thibodeau and Jamar Cain both kind of talked about their line and talked about Reggie Grimes was a guy that kind of hit a wall midway through the fall camp, and for whatever happened, something clicked, and he climbed over that wall, and he's playing outstanding football right now. So he'll play a lot, and certainly a guy that could be disruptive at the end position. Nose tackle, no surprise. Perion Winfrey starts here with a guy that that made a lot of plays, was a constant double team, especially last part of the year. And he destroyed the double teams, and I think he was a guy. The only problem that he had was really kind of finishing some of those plays for Oklahoma. So I think having him come back, first of all, was huge, and I think he's made a gigantic leap from everything I've heard. So his ability to get to the quarterback, his ability to stop the run, and his pursuit, I think is going to be big for Oklahoma. Just if he's able to finish some of those plays in the backfield versus just kind of versus just making them move to another part of the field. So Josh Ellison is another kid that's played well last year, has made big strides, along with Jordan Kelly, the local product here out of Tulsa, is another guy that had played extremely well, through the fall camp. So a guy that's going to play a lot. So, Lincoln Riley and I mean specifically Alex Grinch had said that they feel like that they possibly could go 8 deep from a tackle perspective. So I think that's going to be big to be able to get those guys fresh and have them. Be fresh in the fourth quarter of those games. So a defensive tackle, I've got Jalen Redmond coming back. I think he's maybe not quite back to where he was, but I think he's pretty darn close. So he's a guy that's there on that other inside tackle position. Laurent Stokes is sort of kind of the grandfather of the team, just really just in terms of being able to to be a guy that's played a lot, had a little bit of injury situation go on last year, and then Corey Roberson, getting that additional depth there at the defensive tackle spot as well. Moving over to the linebackers, Nick Benito, obviously at the rush position. I've heard commentary that Benito might be the best player on this team. And that's coming from kind of inside the program and maybe even some offensive coaches. And so high praise for a kid. So I think he's a kid that you could see if he has a monster year, having 11, 12 sacks. I think Oklahoma will have a guy that's in that double-digit sack range, or anywhere from 10 to 12, and could have a couple of people there. So Benito's a guy that has got a lot of preseason accolades, first team All-American preseason, Big 12 could be a defensive player of the year. So I think he's very versatile. And his big thing last year was really just kind of speed rush, and I think he's got a couple of different moves that he's added to his repertoire, in terms from a pass rusher. So I think look for him to have a big year as well. Marcus Stripling has kind of moved over from the defensive end to this rush backer spot. I think it's a little bit more suited to his talent. And then you got the young kids, Clayton Smith, who obviously he's a true freshman, but he's played well through camp. I think he's a guy that will get some spot duty, maybe in some predictable third and long possessions where he can just go and just rush the quarterback and it doesn't really have to think, but just rushes that quarterback at that spot. Then moving to the mic, I got David Agwebu as a starter. Deshaun White's providing that depth. Both of those will play a lot. Both those kids will play a lot, and then Shane Witter as well from a depth perspective there. I think when you look at Agwebu, he's got the size, he's got the intangibles to be a Kenneth Murray type player. So if he's able to put it all together, I think that'll be big for Oklahoma to kind of solidify the middle of the field. Deshaun White played a couple of years here. I think he's very cerebral, knows where to be. Maybe he doesn't have the same athleticism and size that Agwebu does, but certainly knows where to be, and it's not going to be caught out of position. And Shane Witter, one of the fastest guys on the team, regardless of position, but certainly in the linebacker group, who's a guy that Brian Odom had talked about is his mistakes that he's making is a little bit less this year than he's seen, which you would expect coming from a guy that's been in the program for a year now. So he's a guy that's going to play a lot as well. Then when you get into the will position, you've got Brian Asamoah as your starter. Very, very reliable. He's another guy that's got to take another step this year. The leading tackler for Oklahoma, but has got to bring that consistency. Caleb Kelly is another guy that has been here forever. I think a guy that you kind of root for to be good, to be successful. With the injuries that he's had over the last couple of years, they're actually moving him around, playing a little bit of rush as well. So you could see him, see him play rush, from time to time, as well. And then Danny Stutzman is a wild card. He's a guy to a person. Everyone's talks about how impressive he is. Maybe one of the most impressive true freshmen that they have. I think he's going to play a lot. I don't see him being third team all year, so they could move him to the mic. They could move him around in different spots, really just to get him on the field. But I think I've even heard some people say that they wouldn't be surprised if he's starter. I think he's got a lot of ground to make up just in terms of some of the kids that have already been here. With a Brian Asamoah, with a David Agwebu, but certainly could see him as a guy that's going to play a lot, especially early on, just to kind of get that feeling out process going. Then moving to the secondary cornerback, I've got DJ Graham as one of the starters, and then have Jaden Davis as a primary backup. I think DJ Graham has the biggest upside, just from a athletic perspective than we've got really anyone in the secondary, specifically at the cornerback position. Still learning how to play the position, and from some of the things that I've heard, he'll have periods of just outstanding, out of this world play, and then there'll be some periods of just average play. So that consistency, as you would expect from a young guy, getting there. And then Jaden Davis has played a few years in the has been here for a few years in the program, and has been a solid contributor. Will be counted on to be another solid contributor and play a lot for Oklahoma this year. And then the right cornerback, I've got Woody Washington here. Wouldn't at all be surprised to see Justin Harrington grab that spot. Heard a lot of really great things out of him. Just his athleticism. I think a lot of people coming in with his size just assumed he'd be maybe a nickel or a safety of some sort, but I think he's still firmly entrenched as being a cornerback. Not that they couldn't use him at nickel, not that they couldn't use him at any of the safety positions, but I think right now, he's a guy that size that Grinch is looking for. Is there, and the athleticism and speed is what you would expect. And Latrell McCutcheon, I think, is a guy that's going to get better and better. Would not be incredibly surprised at all by Texas to see McCutcheon maybe even being the starter. I think he's got that high enough of an upside, and he's got the size that Grinch likes as well. Really very similar to a Justin Harrington. So I think when you look at those cornerbacks, I think all five of those play a lot. But I wouldn't at all be surprised to see Latrell McCutcheon being the starter at some point in the season. Strong safety, it's pretty much more solidified here. I think Delarian Turner-Yell is your clear starter at strong safety, with Bryson Washington providing backup. Turner-Yell we knew a couple of years ago with him out of that playoff game against LSU how much he was missed. So I think he's solid there in the back end with Bryson Washington, providing that backup. I'm not sure how much exactly Washington will play. I think he's a guy that I think Oklahoma has expected a little bit more of at this point, but certainly he'll get in the mix and provide some depth for Oklahoma there. At the free safety position, again, this is one of the tougher decisions, that I looked at when trying to determine what that free safety spot looks like. I think they've got a lot of comfortability, they've got a lot of trust, and Pat Fields, he's a team captain last year. I think he's a guy it's a big emotional leader on this team. However, you got a guy like Key Lawrence who is you know to to a T. Some of these coaches and players have said that when he's on, one of the best players on the defensive team. So I think when you look at Key Lawrence, he's probably one of your top 11 guys. So I think both of these kids will play a lot. I think they'll have a little bit more trust in Pat Fields initially. Would not at all be surprised within a couple of games here to see Key Lawrence starting there. As we move into the nickel, just the last part of the defense, I've got Billy Bowman as the starter. I think Jeremiah Cardell has been a little injured early on in camp, and I think that's really kind of paved the way. Bowman is a guy, just a testament to him on how athletic he is, how quick he is, how smart he is. Everything that I've heard, you tell him something once and you don't tell it to him again. He's very intelligent, and I think that's a guy that you need at that position because Grinch asks that guy to do a lot. You've got to cover some tight ends. You've got to be able to rush the quarterback. You've got to be able to tackle in open space and make good decisions in the secondary. So both those kids will certainly play, but from everything I've been hearing, I think Bowman has grabbed that job. And so let's finish out here with some of the specialists, and then we'll talk. To some of your comments and questions here. So, at the punter position, the transfer from Arizona State, Michael Turk, one of the best punters in the country. If you don't know a whole lot about him, read up about him. He had moved to Oklahoma because of the vaccination requirements on the West Coast. He's one of the few guys on the roster that has not been vaccinated, and I think Riley approached this as a personal choice. If you don't feel strongly about wanting to be vaccinated, I think this is a choice that you can make, individually, and not something that's being pressed upon you. So I think he's a guy that will start. He averaged 47 yards per punt last year. Munchau was at 37, so I think he brings a little bit of a better dimension, I think, to that punting game for Oklahoma. But Oklahoma has a lot of depth there. Either way that they go, it looks like Oklahoma has the ability to could play both of those guys if needed. Kicker Gabe Burkich, so that there's not a surprise there. I think Zach Schmidt will provide some backup. Kicked a couple of field goals in the early on in the season last year. Then through the spring game we saw him there. So he'll provide that depth, but certainly Gabe Burkich is one of the best kickers in the country. Will be our place kicker. Punt returners, I got Marvin Mims. Certainly he'll stay there. Drake Stoops will provide that backup. Lincoln Riley basically cemented that early on in the week, talked about what that depth looked like, and he's the guy there. Then finally here from a returner perspective, Billy Bowman and Mario Williams is the two that I think that we'll see. Kind of coming there, returning kicks. I think DJ Graham's a guy that you could see. I had heard, obviously no longer on the team, but Trey Bradford was a guy that they had looked at as well. So I think you've got DJ Graham there that could possibly be there. I've heard Eric Gray could be a guy that returns kicks. I think with where Oklahoma's at from a depth perspective, that's probably out the window now. So I think Billy Bowman and Mario Williams are your number one, number two guys that will return kickoffs for the Sooners this year. So let's kind of go to some of your comments here as we talk through the defense. Nagurski, yeah, Benito's one of the guys up for the Nagurski. If he has the year that I think a lot of us think and hope that he might, he certainly could be one of those guys that could possibly be in the running there. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know that I would necessarily agree that he doesn't have the talent. I don't think he's necessarily a top guy. One of your top three linebackers, and maybe not even. Could be a guy that gets overthrown by Danny Stutzman as well. But I think he'll play. He'll be a factor. He certainly won't be a starter, I don't think, but I think he'll play and he'll be a little bit of a factor for Oklahoma this year. Swamp Fox 2.0, thanks for the question. Or for the well, yeah. If Witter's so fast, maybe he gets some time at running back. I think that's a question. That's a thought. I think that's in some of Oklahoma's deep contingencies with a Brian Darby player. So I think he could be. I think he could be in the mix there as well. Graham lead the secondary interceptions. Wouldn't at all be surprised about that at all. To see him lead. He's a ball hawker. I think he'll be right there around the ball at all times for Oklahoma. Absolutely. Looking at Mike Woods, I don't know that I would agree that he was the best wide receiver on the poor Arkansas team. He led the SEC in yards per reception last year. He was right there. He was one of the top receivers for Arkansas. Him and the other guys, the name's escaping me right now, but he was tied with receptions for the last 2 years for Arkansas. So I just think that he's in a better position for himself, surrounding himself with much better talent at Oklahoma at the quarterback position, which allows him to be a factor. Rattler has been speaking very, very highly of him, so I think I think he'll be a guy that's going to play a lot. I think he'll be a big factor for Oklahoma this year. Carvin Jackson, I should say. Are you waiting on the longer, faster, younger defensive backs to take over? I think that's inevitable. I think to a certain extent. I think DJ Graham is a guy that although he doesn't have the size as maybe a Justin Harrington, doesn't have the size as a Josh Eaton, doesn't have the size of a Latrell McCutcheon. I think the athleticism, he plays much bigger than what he really is. So I think some of those kids will have the chance to solidify themselves towards the end of the year. Even towards the middle of the year. So I think that's good. So thanks everybody for joining today. Like I said, next week we will get started. We'll get ramped up with our Tulane coverage. We'll talk a lot about the game, and between now and then there'll be a lot of news that kind of comes to the forefront, just in terms of what's going to happen with that game. Is the game going to still be played as we would expect it to be played in New Orleans? Does it get moved to Norman? Does it get canceled? Does it get rescheduled to later in the year? I think all those are contingencies that Oklahoma are working with. I think based on what I'm hearing, there's a decent chance that it could be moved to Norman. Oklahoma actually plays Tulane in the 2024 season, so I think it would be very easy for Oklahoma to just go to New Orleans in 2024 and move that here to Norman if that should happen. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. I think we'll have a good idea, at some point Sunday or most definitely Monday for those that are traveling, or those are got plane tickets. Those are got air and hotel, Airbnb, whatever that might be. So I think they'll probably make a decision sooner. Sooner than later, but enjoy the games today. Nebraska, Illinois, if it hasn't kicked off, it's getting ready to kick off here pretty soon. And then we've got UCLA and Hawaii a little bit later. But enjoy the games, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks for joining.